All right, so you're here to talk about Section 230 and the Supreme Court cases, and we haven't gotten to that yet, which
Oh,
is
this is
pretty
far more
typical.
interesting in my opinion.
What?
It's always a delight talking to you, but
Oh, I
this is
totally,
more interesting.
you changed my life on so many levels. Okay, so first of all, you and I have had these conversations. You're just a little bit ahead of me in terms of career wise, right? Because you got your first job in 2001, is that right? 2000,
2002 is when I actually
2002,
started.
and I was 2007. So, I mean, my first permanent job. I had jobs before that. So again, just a little bit ahead. And I remember becoming, I think, either as I was becoming a full professor, and I was like, well, what do I do now? Like, my whole life had been like trying to achieve these goals that the university had. And you're like, well, sit back and decide what you really want to do. You only get a certain finite amount of time. Like, what is it that you want to spend your time doing? That's the joy of the job. And it became this quilting podcast and the quilting thing. Like, I really did want to explore spaces that weren't being explored by other people, and that was really came out of that conversation, which you won't remember, but it was life
I
changing.
do remember it.
You
And
do?
let's just be
Yeah.
clear, you are living your best life. You
Yeah.
have so much privilege having a tenured
Oh, I know, right?
position at a fine institution like Tulane. Um, and yet you're using that privilege to go off and have conversations that are really important in communities that may not be used to having those conversations.
Yeah,
So, like, what more could you possibly ask
I
for? I
agree.
will tell you, I did ultimately write up a top 10 tips for newly tenured
I
professors
think I've seen it. It's
because
great,
this was
right?
such a frequently asked question. What do I
Yeah,
do next? How do I,
right. What do you do
how do I
next?
make
Yeah,
decisions for the rest of my life now that I've achieved the brass ring?
right. Exactly.
But I
Exactly.
do remember that conversation, and the fact
Yeah.
that I might have had any input at all into your
Oh,
professional
hugely.
choices
Because it really
is
was
just
this
heartwarming to
moment.
me.
Because the way that the profession works is you're always, at least for me, I always felt like I was doing my own work but trying to please others, particularly Glenn Lunny, because he was on faculty at that time. So it was like, well, what does Glenn want me to be writing next, right? Because there's a sense of like, well, you're going to be judged and judged and judged and judged. And so, and then suddenly you're not. And it was like, whoa, like, what do we do now? So yeah, I really, and also you're such a model for, I mean, we need to talk more. My next goal is from the quilting community to push out to other communities that are creative communities and how to do that. I'm not sure how to do that at the moment. But you are such a model of a law professor that's super duper smart, like the smartest one on the planet, but also using that knowledge to expand it to other spaces. And I think that is so amazing. And also the fact that you give legitimacy to spaces that a lot of us are working really crazy, weird roller derby or tattoos or whatever it is, right? And fashion, because that's what intellectual property is. And I think that having you as one of those that do that lets others do it as well. And I think that's really, really important because emoji law is important. It turns out to be, right? It's not a joke. It sounds funny, but it
We know
actually,
emoji law is important because my daughter, who's a teenager, thought it was interesting. And
yes,
if I can come up with any possible way of appealing to a teenage girl to get her interested in the work that her daddy does,
totally,
then that is a
totally.
huge win.
Totally. Okay. Section 230. So, what do we have to? So it's in the news, and you talk about it a lot, and you are one of the very leading experts on this. And we hear this word, we hear these numbers, and what does a quilter or crafter or someone need to know about this conversation? And the Supreme Court's hearing things. What is 230? And why do we talk about 230?
So I love talking about Section 230. It's such an important life. In fact, important part of our lives. In fact, I just spoke to some undergrads yesterday at Santa Clara University, and one of them said, Professor Goldman, I'm just like my mind's blown. There's this thing called Section 230, and I had never known about it.
Right.
And now, and only now, am I realizing just how important it is to my life.
Yeah.
And I was so ecstatic to hear that,
Yeah.
evangelizing Section 230 to
Right.
Gen Z to get them to realize
Right.
like there's this really foundational law that they don't realize operates in the background and enables them to do lots of things. So Section 230 says, to summarize very efficiently, websites aren't liable for third-party content. It's a very simple premise. If you ask people, assume that there's conversations that are taking place online that are not good. We could say that they're illegal or tortious, or we could just say that they're antisocial. who should be responsible for it? Should it be the people who are talking or the people who are mediating that conversation? And when you ask questions like that, people say, well, of course, the people who are talking, they're responsible for their words. The people who are mediating the conversation, that's not their responsibility to be owning the conversation that way. And that's what Section 2 says. The people who commit harms online are responsible for their harms, but the people in the middle aren't. And that foundational principle has been the basis of the entire Web 2.0 ecology. All the things that we do online today involve us talking to each other. And those are the most popular services. Those are the places where we spend the most time, where we invest the most energy. And they're all fueled by this legal principle that says we can talk to each other, but the people enabling the conversations are responsible for them.
And so what happened? So if we have this beautiful law and it's wonderful, why is it at the Supreme Court?
Well, a lot of things have gone wrong in the last few years, but in general, I would point to the underlying source that there's been this broad-based techlash, that people are nervous about the amount of power and wealth that's accumulated in the hands of a small number of players. And over the years, we've seen that those players have transgressed our trust in a variety of ways. And that's created this dynamic where we instinctively want to punish or push back on these sources of power. And so we're saying, how can we stick it to Google and Facebook? That's basically like everyone in the world wants to stick it to Google and Facebook. And politicians are capitalizing on that by saying, we have a way of sticking it to Google and Facebook. And if they sell their message that way to the voters are like, get them, tear them up, take them down. And that entire dynamic of the politicians preying on our skepticism of sources of power and our desire to see companies like Google and Facebook get their comeuppance has led to a very toxic environment where the conversations include dramatic reforms or outright repeal of Section 230, which would change the foundational principles that allow us to talk to each other online.
And so there are two Supreme Court cases, and they're both calling into question Section 230. What should the regular person be looking for, and why? What are you thinking about with these two cases?
So if you don't mind, I just want to say a few words about the cases so that we're clear about why they matter and don't. So the cases both involve the same basic fact pattern, that there was a terrorist attack that was either inspired by or was encouraged by terrorist organizations. And the plaintiffs believe that the terrorist organizations facilitated their terrorism objective by disseminating content on social media services like Twitter and YouTube. So the lawsuit is to hold the social media services liable for the terrorist attacks because the terrorists were able to spread their message on social media. There's a lot of legal problems with these lawsuits. And until a decision in 2021, they had all failed in court. The courts uniformly had said these lawsuits are not meritorious for a variety of reasons. And then there was this weird kink where the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in the West said, well, maybe there's some merit to these cases. And that opened up the door now for these questions that otherwise would have been pretty easy to answer. What the plaintiffs are trying to do is to hold the social media services for publishing third-party content. Now, maybe content that we don't want them to publish, like content from terrorists, but the principle is very clear. Websites aren't liable for third-party content. Now, one of the cases squarely involves Section 230. The plaintiffs say, I understand that the terrorist content is protected by Section 230. The social media services aren't liable for that, but I still want to hold them liable. And they came up with a rather lame theory to try and do that, saying that it wasn't because they were hosting the terrorist content, but because they had recommended the terrorist content. And that argument went pretty poorly in the Supreme Court. I would be very surprised if the Supreme Court buys it. The other case argued that actually Section 230 hadn't even come up yet in the case. The court had decided on the statutory grounds, the claim that the plaintiffs are bringing. And the question in the statute is basically, what did those social media services know and when did they know it? And what should they have done about that knowledge? And those are the kinds of questions that Section 230 has preempted in the past. We don't normally run into those questions. And that hearing was incredibly tendentious. It was tedious. It was arcane. It was theoretical. It was ivory tower type stuff. And that's what the future of Section 230 looks like if it's repealed or amended. We're going to be spending lots of time asking questions. What do the services know? When do they know it? And what can we do about that? And those kinds of questions are not in anyone's interest. Those are only, except maybe the plaintiffs. They're not going to be a win for the current ecosystem.
So I really do want to get to the dog toy case, but let me ask: when there are problems, when there is a lot of hate, or when things go badly on the internet, are there ways to stop that, or should that just keep flowing? Is Section 230 the wrong place? Is it up to the internet service provider, Facebook, to say your I don't know. How do listeners understand the difference between like what we need for Section 230 versus sort of behavior that we find is becoming destructive in society? Because I think that's the question in some way, right?
Yeah, this is like existential questions, right? Like, what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to live in a complex society? And how do we govern and manage our relationships in this complex society where we're all human and we have, these really great tendencies, and we also have some base tendencies. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that. The first thing to know is that we can't expect humans to be better online than they are offline. And the reality is that humans have done many terrible things to each other offline, and they have done so for millennia. That's an intrinsic part of us being in complex societies. Yeah. So I think there's a panacea that maybe the internet can somehow magically cure all of our human flaws. And as long as we believe that, we're never going to be satisfied with the internet. But if we say we know that the internet's going to be flawed because humans are flawed, it helps us calibrate the baseline. What's the expected level of antisocial behavior online? It's not zero. And thinking it's zero is the recipe for really bad policy.
I like that a lot.
So the other thing to point out is that there's a lot of antisocial behavior that is protected by the First Amendment, not by Section 230, although Section 230 might lead to the same result. But you take away Section 230, the same legal conclusion. So, for example, things that we might categorize as hate speech are protected by the First Amendment. So Congress and the states cannot ban hate speech, even if they want to, even if they can show that it's causing harm to their constituents. The First Amendment has taken that power away from the legislatures. So a lot of the things that people are upset about with the internet are unfortunately or realistically covered by the First Amendment. They're off limits for the regulators to do anything about. Yeah. And that's actually where Section 230 is part of the solution, not the problem. What Section 230 says is that you have, as a service mediating conversations, a legal protection for how you mediate those conversations. If people don't like how you're mediating them, you have a legal defense no matter what the problem is they have with it. And so Section 2 actually enables and encourages services to do more to try and clean up conversations without holding them liable for whatever mistakes they make or whatever they miss. And so to the extent that we want a solution to constitutionally protected antisocial behavior, actually Section 230 is part of the solution.
Amazing. Okay, I have two more things to ask you about. We're running out of time. Okay, dog toys. So, dog toys.
Back to quirky IP professor topics.
Indeed. Well, dog toys are also up at the Supreme Court this season. So, why? I seemed like this was kind of settled to me. But I'm not. I dabble in trademark and I do trademark work now, but I'm not like an expert on trademark. Why is there a dog toy case at the Supreme Court? And wasn't Chewy Vuitton didn't we already have like you can make quirky dog toys that are puns on products? Or why do you think this is there? and help
So we
explain what
talked
it
about
is.
how IP professors love to collect artifacts
Yes.
of the subject materials. So I have repeatedly submitted expenses, the reimbursements to
too.
the university for
Me
buying
too.
dog toys. And I'll get the
That's
call
really
occasionally
great.
from the accounting
Mine
office
was
like,
Barbies, but yes, at one point, the financial people were like, you cannot buy toys for your children. I'm like, I'm not. This is not for my kid.
it just, you know,